So I'm just gonna really quickly give a little bit of background on Care First South Pasadena. For folks who don't know us, we're a small but mighty coalition in South Pasadena working on realignment of our city budget away from policing and towards social services. So, to that end, we want to, this is just one of a whole series of speakers we're planning to bring into the city to talk about different issues related to policing, different functions that police officers are performing in our city and other cities that, we may be better served having other types of professionals performing. And so we're so thrilled to have so many of our elected representatives on the call. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Zahir. We really, really, really appreciate you, making time. I know you're so busy. And we think this is going to be a really valuable presentation. Let me just pull up the slide deck so that's ready to go. London, do you want to quickly just introduce our wonderful speakers?
Yes, give me one moment. Sorry, my internet's kind of slow today, but I believe it will suffice. So today for our speakers, we have Treesje Empowers Thomas. She is a mental health professional, published in television, spoken word artist, MA PPS in educational psychology from Loyola Marymount University. Treesje has contributed her voice to shifting perceptions and advocating for students with special needs and students of color for the past decade. Treesje continues to expand to reach of self. I'm sorry if I butchered the last name. She is a law professor at Golden Gate University School of Law, where she teaches criminal law and juvenile law. Jyoti's articles, oh, oh.
Sorry about that.
Jyoti's articles expose her over police schools criminalize race and disability. Jyoti's spearheaded a web-based education project on juvenile justice laws to empower youth and families. Jyoti is partnered with the African American Policy Forum and UCLA to end incarceration of pregnant youth in LA County. She led a grassroots effort in her Long Beach community to keep community access to her children's elementary school playground while redefining community safety. Those are our speakers.
Thanks, London. And then if I can get this to actually play instead of, how does that look? That looks okay?
Yeah, that looks great.
All right, Helen, you gonna jump in?
Yeah, so before we really get into our discussion tonight, we wanted to do a land acknowledgement and to acknowledge that South Pasadena, where most of us are tonight, and where I am currently, is on the land of the Hahamanga tribe. These are the people that were the stewards of this land long before South Pasadena became established as a city, and it was part of the Tongva Nation. So as many of you guys know today, the Tongva people are still living within their communities, and they're still stewards of our land. And then reflecting on that tonight, I thought about the really painful history of the Indigenous people before us and the history of genocide, of colonial oppression, and how that oppression continues to this day. And tonight we're going to be talking about the institution of policing and how that continues to oppress many of us in the community still, and particularly communities of color. So I'd like to take a moment to pause to reflect upon that. And I found an interesting Facebook page today about certain words of the Tongva language that I'd like to share, and we can take a look at it and remember the people that came before us that are still here today, and the shared history that we are carrying forward together.
Will you put that in the chat, Helen?
Yeah, I will.
Awesome. Okay, Jyoti, I think we're ready for you, and you just let
Yes,
me know when you want me to change the slide.
sounds good. So I'll have you start there. Thank you all for having me. And thank you to Ella for inviting me to join all of you this evening. It's such an honor. I said to Ella when we spoke about this presentation that, I wear my hat when I speak to all of you. Part why you invited me was probably because I'm a criminal law professor. My specialty is juvenile justice and how the criminalization of children impacts their lives. But I come to you tonight not just as a law professor, but as a parent. And I have two children in public schools. One has just started middle school, one just started public high school. I live in Long Beach, California. I myself am a product of public school from elementary, middle, high school, even college. So I wear that hat when I come to all of you. As you heard in my intro, and thank you to London for that intro, we recently, pre-COVID, underwent quite a revolutionary groundswell organizing campaign here in my own community. Not directly related to policing, but very connected, because our school was fencing out our local elementary school and not allowing for evening access and all public access, which was a dramatic shift in policy from what we had before. So we had the same sort of conversations that you're all having now that we were also having in our community. So with that, I'd like to start. I love to start with this quote because to me, it embodies what is fundamentally wrong with the way we currently criminalize the way we treat our children, particularly our poor children. And when we say poor in Southern California and California at large, most of the poor children, particularly in the districts that we're going to talk about tonight, tend to be Black and brown children. That doesn't mean that there aren't Indigenous children or Asian children or Hmong children or Cambodian children like in Long Beach, but they tend to be mostly students of color, if not exclusively children of color. But the way we treat our children directly impacts what they believe about themselves. And if you could just sort of hold on to that quote during my slides, I would really appreciate it, because I want you to think for us to think hard on that. And before you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Ella. Several of the slides that I'm going to rely on tonight come from the Advancement Project report that's called We Came to Learn. It's accessible on their website, and I just want to acknowledge their efforts because they put together this report that I think is a really fantastic educational tool, and I use it now as I talk to people about policing specifically, because they really pull together a lot of information. The quote I like to start with when I talk about policing is one from Brittany Packnett, who's one of the original organizers around BLM. This is from this quote I think is from 1995. And she says, "The first time a lot of Black and brown children experience police violence is in a school building. The first place that our children learn to fear police, learn they're controlled instead of empowered, is in a school building." It's a pretty powerful quote when you think about it. And I usually like to start my conversations there. Today I thought, because you have Treesje here to talk to you about really speaking about sort of the voice of the students and the voice of the experience of somebody who's on the ground. So I thought I would spend the few minutes that I have with all of you kind of giving you a little bit of a history of how school policing came to be, to situate this within kind of this larger context. I appreciated Helen's introduction to tonight, kind of situating kind of the history of our communities in this context. So Ella, if you want to just keep scrolling, I think you can just scroll through the history and I'll just talk. The introduction of, you can maybe pause it, for a little bit and move on. So really the introduction of of policing today we would have to sort of start back in the early 1940s. So in the 1940s in Indianapolis, public schools hired a special investigator to serve the school district from about late 1930s to early 1950s. And they originally named that person the supervisor of special watchmen. And then in 1970, the watchman would become the Indiana Public School District. In Los Angeles, we can trace our origins back to 1948. When a security unit was created to patrol schools under the pretense of protecting school property after integration. So very deeply connected to the history of this country. In 1953, the first school resource officer was created in Flint, Michigan. It was branded as an attempt to improve community relations between the city's youth and the local police department. After they got some favorable media attention, it continued to grow. Then you started to see them pop up in Tucson, the same year in Florida, a year later in Baltimore. And in 1969, in New York City, started to expand. And New York City, as we know, is the largest police department in the country. In Chicago, around that same time, the police department used plainclothes officers to police school settings, patrolling in South Side neighborhoods, and used it as a preventative measure. By 1972, urban school districts in 40 states had some form of school policing infrastructure in their schools. And it goes without saying that police presence was almost immediately accompanied by policy changes that criminalized students. For example, shortly after establishing its school security force in Maryland, the Maryland State Legislature passed a law making it a crime to disturb school activities. And I think it's important to sort of think about that as we start to see sort of the rise of police, we start to see kind of the criminalizing, the laws on the books for criminalizing behavior of children, because the sort of two go hand in hand. And that really is an important context to think about. I'll fast forward. I mean, this won't be a history lesson because it is 7 o'clock on a weekday, but in the late 1960s, President Nixon declared what many of you, if you're students of history, and many of us who are alive remember, was a war on drugs that rapidly increased kind of the policing of Black and brown children and Black and brown people. What was particularly interesting around that time, though, was you started to sort of see, as you started to see kind of a movement of criminalizing of low-level behaviors, you started to sort of see not just an increase in general policing, but sort of policing moving into the school setting. Under Giuliani, the New York Board of School of Education voted to transfer school safety from educators to the New York Police Department in the late 1990s. And today, the School Safety Division of NYPD is the largest school police force in the country, with over 5,200 school police officers. We fast forward all the way to sort of zero tolerance policies that started happening in the 1990s. So I think for a lot of us, our immediate memory around why school police started to increase was in light of the recent shootings that have happened, that probably happened in many of our lifetimes, and for some, even the younger students, the ones they remember. But really, the school police actually started in the 1990s when, under President Clinton, they created the Office of Community-Oriented Police Services, which was called COPS. And that was the largest crime bill to date that actually radically increased the amount of funding to schools and communities. So this was sort of a machine that was sort of moving along its way, right? There was sort of increasing, starting to see increasing of funding of school police, starting to see police differently. And then in 1999, we had what was one of our first nationally known shootings, which was the 1999 Columbine shooting in Colorado. And during that specific attack, 2 high school seniors were shot and killed. Two high school seniors shot and killed 12 students and a teacher and injured 24 students. And immediately there became sort of this notion that we have to sort of increase security, increase safety, protect the community. And so the Department of Justice started increasing their grant fold. I think it went up like 10-fold during that time. About $750 million in grants were given that time, and more than 6,500 school police officers were hired during that time. Then that was followed in 2012 by the shooting at Sandy Hooks, and then the 2018 shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High. And as a result, we started to sort of see this notion that we have to keep our schools safe. And the solution to keep our schools safe was not, and I'm sure Treesje will talk about this, was not addressing the root cause, which was the mental health issues that preceded the school shootings, but that we need to sort of, arm up the schools and continue to have school resource officers. You also started to see the shields being built at the schools, the gates going up, particularly in urban schools, the fencing in, the locking, the bulletproof. A lot of schools now have bulletproof shields when you when you enter the school. Even at our own law school, I was teaching at UCLA at the time, we even started to build, even in our dean's office, the sort of bulletproof shield started to be built during that time. So it wasn't just the elementary schools. It was starting to we're starting to see it play out in all the different universities. So where we're at today now, as a result of that, is the largest presence of school police officers that we've ever had. The National Association of School Resource Officers estimates that there are between 1,400 and 20,000 school resource officers nationwide. And if our history, teaches us anything, it's that the presence of police in schools serving primarily students of color reflect an effort to continue to control and criminalize Black and brown youth. And Ella, if you can go a little bit, go just one more slide. I mean, I'll leave these slides with you. Again, these are all from the advancement project. The issue, of course, comes to, and this is the issue we face with our playground, is this is an issue of not just budgets, but the values, right? So our values often reflect our budgets, and the elected officials who are here today know that, that what you sort of prioritize in your budget is really a reflection of the values. And I think that the movement now that has started across the country to rethink whether or not police are the best way to keep our communities safe is kind of a returning, I would say, to the values of really what education is. The last study that was done, national study that was done of teachers in schools and elementary schools, overwhelmingly were not in favor of having school police officers, school resource officers. And I think that sometimes we forget that the people that are most impacted by the presence of police officers are the voices who are sort of least heard. And again, this is a conversation I had with my own school district when they were talking about fencing our playgrounds in terms of really how you define safety. And what we tried to convince the group was that the way we define safety is community, and that our community feels safe if we have access to our playgrounds. Our community feels safe if we feel welcomed. Our community feels safe if we don't see school resource officers. Ella, if you don't mind continuing just a couple more slides, and I want to just go back really quick. So as again we talk about values, this is the student to council ratio that ideally should exist. So the green is sort of ideally what should exist. So ideally, the national mandate suggests that we should have 250 students per every counselor in high school. You can see where California is. We're at over 800. This was data that's about 5 years old, but I wouldn't suspect it's changed that much. So California notoriously, forget even Pasadena or Long Beach or LA, California as a state is notoriously poor at how we treat our children in our public schools. And that's something that's just falls on sort of all of us that care deeply about public education. And then if you don't mind, Ella, going to the next slide. Again, this data is also now 5 years old. But if you look again if you think about values and you think about the way we spend our money, this is the way we have chosen. This is the way LAUSD chose to sort of decide where to put their money. And I know Treesje is going to talk about it, and I read the articles about the issues that are coming up in your community around not having social workers at the schools, but yet having presence of police officers. And I want us to really think about values, and the way to sort of really approach it as you think deeply about this is, what are we valuing? I mean, fundamentally, what are we valuing? Where are we sort of putting our money? And what studies have shown that the presence of school police or school resource officers make students feel safer or sort of help their well-being and their learning, right? And fundamentally, that's really what we're sort of here to support, is we're here to support the well-being and the learning of young people. You can just go ahead and finish. I don't think I have many more. Yeah, so there's kind of now a movement. I included this slide because you're now starting to see in places that people do perceive to be places that you wouldn't always suspect, a movement to kind of completely remove all school resource officers from their communities and their schools. And I think, to me, the movement that has come so quickly has really been remarkable, because many of us have been talking about this for years, but you're starting to really see organizing, thanks to young people, of course, kind of movement and a groundswell of movement around this. So I wanted to include that. I think there's maybe one more slide. Yeah, so these are the sort of recommendations that, again, I'll leave here, but it's really, divest from law enforcement strategies in schools is, again, a reprioritizing of the values and the way we talk about this. Deprioritizing the reliance on school police means now substituting that for social services, psychologists, counselors, nurses, wellness, yoga, holistic services. I mean, all things that we know intrinsically actually help our well-being, right? So, and I think one more slide, and I think my slides are done after this. Yeah, disarm school personnel. That speaks to kind of the movement now to not just have school resource officers, but also to arm them. And as all of you know, to arm teachers. That's another growing issue that's happening in a lot of states, not in our state, but it's happening across. And then, of course, the last one is obvious, which is decriminalize student behavior. But we could be here all night if we talk about that. I think I'll sort of leave you there and let Treesje, and I'd love to have this be sort of a dialogue of questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, Treesje, take it away from here.
Wow. Wow, you got so much in those slides, Jyoti. My goodness. I agree with all of what you said, and it really lays the groundwork for a lot of what I wanted to share today. And as she shared, I really want this to be a dialogue, but there are some really heavy facts and things that I would love to begin to just unpack with you all today. So, as London shared with you all, my name is Treesje Thomas. I am a practicing school psychologist in the LA County area. I've been a school psychologist for 10 years now. I've been working with high school students for about 2 to 3 years, but my experience with students ranges all the way from ages 2 all the way up to 22. And I service students with special needs and disabilities. So I assess for depression, I do crisis counseling with students, I provide one-on-one therapy for students dealing with anxiety, stress, PTSD, emotional disturbance, a number of behaviors. And so this, ironically enough, was my intern question when I interviewed with my district. When you interview with a district, they say, "Do you have any questions for us?" And I asked them, "What is your plan for addressing disproportionality in African American and students of color within special education?" And they all sat back and they said, "Wow, that's a good question." And 10 years later, they still don't have an answer. And so I open with that to share that even when we look at the CDC and the California Department of Education, we see that California is one of the states that is notoriously disproportionate in the way that they discipline students of color across school districts, particularly when we look at students in special education. And so when we look at some of the facts and the statistics, we see that according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the suicide rate among children ages 10 to 17 has actually increased by 70% between 2006 and 2016. So within the last decade, and this was taken in 2016, we saw a 70% increase in depression and mental illness within our students. And then we have to, of course, we cannot discount the current pandemic and quarantine, which has caused suicide rates to skyrocket. And I don't think that we speak about that enough when we're really looking at the impact of even the pandemic and quarantining as a nation. And so about 72% of children in the United States will have experienced at least one major stressful event, witnessing violence, experiencing abuse, or even experiencing the loss of a loved one, right? And we have many of our children now experiencing those things way more than we would like. And so when we think about those things, we often see that the first place that a student is going to go is their teacher, is their counselor, is school. Students spend 6 hours a day in the school setting. This is where they're receiving all of their input. And so when we see a disproportionate rate of police officers, school security, campus supervisors. We have all of these staff that are intended to keep the students safe. And then you go in the front office and there's one counselor and there's a psychologist, particularly in LAUSD, that's not even there full time. That is a roving psychologist who is only there long enough to complete an assessment, review a report, and then they have to shuffle on to the next school. I am very blessed with my district that I am 5 days a week full time at one high school site, but that is actually still not aligned with the National Association of School Psychologists standards when we talk about ratios. And I'll share a little bit about what they recommend when we look at mental health professionals. But when we really see where our students are going to go to receive these services and to receive this support, they're going to encounter a supervisor, a custodial staff, maybe a school resource officer before they even see their counselor who is inundated with students. And we see oftentimes with in many populations, students are 21 times more likely to visit school-based health centers for treatment than anywhere else. So schools become a hub for many communities. Every community has a school in it. Not every community even has a grocery store in it. And so when we really look at disproportionality of the availability of mental health resources in many communities, we need to begin to look at how our schools are staffed and equipped to address the mental health needs of our children. And to Jyoti's point, when we see the rise in police officers in schools is a direct correlation to when we saw one, the war on drugs, but two, the rise in school shootings. But what hasn't been addressed is that many, if not all of these students suffer from bullying, depression, anxiety, or some other form of mental illness that then trigger the behavior that rose to the school shooting. And so many of them in those moments, we say they were a good student, they were quiet or shy, or they didn't have many friends. But I bet you the counselor knew them. I bet you the psychologist may have seen them once, and not for lack of trying, but because of just their own time that they had available to give. And so when we see the availability of mental health professionals, we also see that it actually benefits our students to have those kinds of resources available to them. Schools that have mental health counselors, psychologists, and those things actually see an increase in student attendance, student connectedness, student engagement, and student achievement. I actually have an article from the ACLU that actually speaks to this as well. When we talk about that data suggests that students that have these resources available to them perform better on all fronts. Socially, they are more well adjusted. Academically, they perform better because they're able to manage stress. And so, in my field, one of my roles is to provide ongoing counseling directly to students to help them to manage a number of issues. And so, when we look at the data that we have, many schools are still not understanding that they need to have a trauma informed approach because many of our students are experiencing trauma outside of the school setting. And so when we introduce police officers, law enforcement into the school, we're also introducing triggers to the school setting. And so a neurological response to a trigger is going to be tension, fear, fight or flight responses of students, and they don't even have to say anything. We have to remember that we are in communities where students may not have positive responses or interactions with police officers because of their family. We are talking about children that may have had family members that were incarcerated, family members that have been arrested, and then the sight of a police officer now triggers that traumatic event. And so we want to begin to look at how we can unpack and really look and tease apart how we can really incorporate another layer of mental health support for our students that allows us to address many of the underlying layers of trauma, of access to resources within many of our communities. When we look at the research and in terms of looking at a trauma informed approach, we see that 21% of low income children and youth, 6 to 17, have some form of mental disorder. And so, how are they accessing that support? How are they getting those resources? When we look at 50% of children and youth in the child welfare system have some sort of mental illness. And when we look at the juvenile justice system, we saw 67 to 70% of youth have some form of diagnosable mental health disorder or learning disability. And students with learning disabilities or mental illness are more likely to encounter law enforcement within their lifetime, disproportionately. Add on to that layer them being a student of color, now we have an even exponentially larger likelihood that they will experience and encounter law enforcement with a negative outcome than any of their counterparts. And so when we really begin to see and dig deep, we say, why is this? What is it about having police officers in the school setting that really kind of drives this wedge? And from my experience, my office is actually directly next door to the school resource officer's office. And he's not there every day, right? He's there maybe 2 times a week, but most of it is to address students that are on probation. Most of it is to address students with attendance issues, right? I rarely see a student come in to ask to speak to the officer, right? But I have a line around the corner of students that I don't have the capacity to see, to meet with me, to speak with me, because they've lost a loved one, because they are depressed, because they may be returning from being hospitalized. And so I wish that I could serve the 1,200 students that are on my campus. I have a caseload of 100 and going on 150 students that I am responsible for within the special education framework. But the other 1,100 students still know who Mrs. Thomas is, still will have access to me because I have an open door policy. But if we don't work together with our mental health professionals, we run the risk of having staff burnout. We run the risk of turnover rates, which then prevents our students from building connection and rapport with trusted staff because they don't have the familiarity of those professionals and those individuals. The National Association of School Psychologists actually states that their recommended ratio of students to school counselors is 250 to 1. When we do the math, that's about 6 to 7 counselors per high school. When you really think about it, if you think in your mind, how many counselors did you have in your high school when you went to school? Did you know them? When we look at school psychologists, their rate is 500 to 700 per student. I've already told you my school rate, so I'm about 2 to 1, right? And so even with social workers, they say 400 to 1. We have one social worker, well, one and one in training for our entire district. What's wrong with this picture? But we have an SRO at every campus. Every principal has Covina PD on speed dial, and they will call them instead of the PET team, which is the psychiatric emergency team, in order for a student to be hospitalized. Why? Because the PET team takes too long. The Covina PD is doing their rounds so they can stop. And so it is not to say that our staff do not care about students. It is not to say that the officers that serve our students are not kind individuals. It is to say that our mental health professionals are overwhelmed, and we are seeing just an exponential increase in the need for our students to feel supported emotionally and mentally. And when they see students being disciplined, right? Emergency holds, being handcuffed, being placed in a police car, even if it is a peaceful transition, it still stirs something in them that is traumatic. I am a grown woman and I still tense up as soon as a police car pulls up behind me. I'm 35 years old and I am still frightened of being pulled over for a tail light. As a woman of color, add another layer to that. And so when we really begin to look at how this is impacting our young people, we have to consider the nature of our society that has now convinced us and programmed us to believe that police make us safe. To Jyoti's point, our communities are what make us safe. Our support systems are what make us safe, or what give us the avenues that we need to defer from paths of crime, to defer from mental breakdowns. That if we can allow those things to be available to our young people, then we can cultivate a society and a culture that allows us to really thrive and flourish emotionally as a society. And so I kind of got on my little soapbox there. I got away from my statistics, but I'm extremely passionate about how we can begin to provide these resources, look at allowing our police officers to do the job that they were trained to do, and allow our mental health professionals to do the job that they were trained to do. That's all I got.
So great. Thank you both. So I want to open it up to questions. But I do want to mention that Eric Fabro is here from the South Pasadenan, which is great. But if you're uncomfortable posting your question, publicly, knowing that there is media here, that's fine. Just send me a chat and I will pose your question for you. Otherwise, we'll just try letting folks jump in. If it gets hectic, I'll have people raise their hand on Zoom.
I have a question. I was wondering, how common is it for police to be, an SRO to be put into the school with a specific mission, which is to protect the children from whatever outside forces might happen, and then just sort of through a lack of anything else to do, the mission drifts and becomes, their attention gets turned towards finding minor offenses. And is there generally any kind of documentation about what they are supposed to be doing in schools? And does that change or fluctuate, or are they just thrown into the school and they can do whatever they want?
I'll take that first, and then Treesje can speak about her experiences in the schools. You're absolutely right. There is an MOU that exists between school resource officers and the school districts, and the MOU has negotiation, the negotiated sort of contract, if you will, standard contract of what actually it's supposed to be. But your question is so astute, because what you're hearing is that school resource officers go in with a certain mission and end up doing something entirely different. And school resource officers will tell you that themselves if you can get them off the record to talk about it. They'll tell you themselves. I remember one high school in LAUSD. I actually took my clinic students when I was at UCLA there, and you had LAPD and the school resource officer sharing an office. So you had the community police officer and the school resource officer in the same office. And now as a criminal defense lawyer, as a lawyer, I keep thinking like, well, what, because the rights for children, when a school resource officer, the right to search is very different for a school resource officer than it is for an LAPD officer. So your Fourth Amendment rights are actually very different if you're considered a school being searched by a school resource officer. And so these are the issues that are, keep lawyers up at night, right? Keep ACLU and public defenders and defenders up at night. But it speaks to kind of what you're, what you're getting at, which is, again, to me, like values, right? Like we have valued now that space. And as Treesje was saying, we saw in a lot of schools, there are some schools where the SRO office is twice the size of the special ed office or the psychology office, right? So there is MOUs, they're supposed to be public documents, they're difficult to find. It's difficult to get, oftentimes, if you really sort of trace the money, it's difficult to kind of get line items. And I know in LA, at least, the way in which they code the school resource officers is different at different schools. So it's difficult to research this, but it's a really good question.
And to your point, we also have to understand that school resource officers are in a helping profession, and they are human beings, and they are there to serve. And so my role is special education, but if my administrator asks me to help out with something, if I'm available, I'm going to help out with something. So we often see this phenomenon of, oh, we have the SRO here, let's pull him in, right? Let's let him have a talk with this kiddo because he tends to be a troublemaker. Maybe the badge and the uniform will get this kid in alignment, right? And so we begin to see the SROs being used as, it's almost like mini scared straight tactic in some areas, where they're just pulled because they're available individuals on campus in order to speak to students or to address issues.
Hi, what is the percentage of canine police program that's existing in California public schools?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, Evelyn, but I do know that there are several school districts that employ canines to do drug searches. in the different school districts. I don't know the number off the top of my head. We'd have to sort of look that up. I actually would be surprised if we could find a number, because I don't know if anybody's sort of keeping track. Because again, the difficulty with these statistics is that it's district by district. And even within the district, unless there's a groundswell and organizing effort by people to find out these numbers, they're not ones that are readily available. I mean, that I've never found any district ready to give up numbers as it relates to sort of school resource officers or K-9. So there are stories in different high schools of K-9s being deployed, but I don't know of the actual number. I don't know if Treesje knows the number.
I don't know the number. And to Jyoti's point, the searches are random and unannounced, and so it's likely that not all of them are tracked accurately, because sometimes they are available, they're in the area, they show up and they say, okay, we're here, right? Or the principal will call and say, hey, I have a feeling, and then they'll come. And so I'm really not sure what the rate is.
What is the impact of that K-9 program to the students? This is for Ms. Powers.
Well, it depends on the population. I worked actually at the continuation school as well. And what I can tell you is that the dogs showed up a lot more there than they do at the comprehensive high school. And so we see a rate of disproportionality in just even the classrooms that the dogs choose to go into, right? Or the schools that the dogs frequent, when we see a certain population of students that are concentrated in that area. And so the students have the ones that are engaged in nefarious activities. They know how to get around it. They're savvy enough, right? But for the other students, unfortunately, it's become just a part of their daily routine. That oh, all right, the dog's here. Time to get up. Leave your backpacks. Everybody line up against this wall. Don't keep your hands out of your pockets. Don't use your phone. And it's very much like a routine police stop. Right? Everyone's against the wall, hands where I could see them. No one can go back in until the dog has done its rounds, and then they come out. They find anything, that student and that bag is then brought up to the office, and the disciplinary actions are taken and carried out from there.
Evelyn, I remember talking to college students that had grown up in LAUSD, and they said when they got to college, they were wondering where the police were. They were actually in their classmates, like, where are the police in the classrooms? And their classmates were like, we don't have them here, because they were so used to police presence, to Treesje's point, that it was uncomfortable. They were wondering, where are they? Like, where are they? Where are the metal detectors? Because that was just such a daily part of their life.
That's pretty sad, actually. And I know that in South Pasadena, this is a very affluent community, but we did have a K-9 program, and they just discontinued it, I think this year or last year, but we did have a K-9 program, which I really don't endorse.
Hi, my name is Noah. I'm actually a student at SPHS right now in 11th grade. And I'm also one of the health and wellness officers in ASB. And so I've met with the other one, and we met with the vice principal of like the student services who deals with discipline. And we asked about like the school resource office, since I know SPHS has one. We found out that the school resource officer isn't funded by the school. It's just kind of given by the SPPD. And so there's not really any overlap between like the funding for that versus like the funding for like a social worker. So that piece isn't really there, but I guess I'm just kind of asking, like, we definitely want to like try to get rid of that position. I don't know how else to put it. So I'm just wondering like what maybe some ways that we can try to like, because I know meeting with that person, the administrator, they seemed like they thought the position was positive, and that's like not what we felt at all. So we're just trying to figure out like how we can kind of move forward about that. And I know the person said they were going to give us some MOU about the position. We haven't gotten that yet. And obviously like we're not on campus now, but I guess I'm just interested in what your thoughts are about that.
I can share to that, Noah. Thank you so much for your share, and I'm so happy to hear that you're connected in a role where you're really trying to make change on your campus. So kudos to you in that regard. I actually joined. I was part of a district-wide training where we looked into restorative practices and how we discipline students overall. And our district actually has a retired police officer, and he does the administrative justice class, and he teaches like a CSI class. But he partnered with a group of students, and they were looking to do almost like a peer mediation where the students, upperclassmen, if you will, would come together for minor offenses to restore relationships between students or to resolve issues to avoid them escalating to the front office. And so if there was a fight, for example, the students would meet with peer mediation and maybe an adult to talk about what went wrong, to talk about how we got to this point, instead of the students having a ticket written or the police officers intervening. So finding additional ways for administration to address discipline within the school infrastructure kind of removes that role of that outside force needing to come in from a top-down perspective. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think, well, I know we already have a peer mediators group at SPHS. I think they're underutilized though, especially in that regard. So I think that's something we could work on too. But thank you for, yeah, that answers it.
And Noah, as a school board member, I think I'd love to hear your perspective on how that individual has been utilized in a negative way on campus, and have that information, from a school board perspective. Again, we do not invest funds in that position. It's something that's funded through South Pasadena Police Department. Our counselor ratios are 225-1 right now. Always could be better, but that's a funding limitation we have, but we've invested as much as we can within that department to keep those ratios low. But right now we do not have a designated liaison, and that's how we see that position up to this point, is much more as a liaison to help us. We have to have a comprehensive safety plan, for example, and things along those lines. That individual helps us as our sort of resource, right? Like what happens in these instances? We're not law enforcement officers. We don't know how that response would come in, or what sort of safety strategies and plans. It's somewhat helpful to have that sort of guidance in that perspective, but we're not trying to utilize them as a enforcement individual on campus. And so it'd be helpful for us to hear from the student perspective as to how that may be being misapplied, or in other ways where there may be concerns there, because I think that's where, again, that individual also in their role serves as security for like dances and football games. This is before your time, but I was at El Paso High School when we had a school shooting, and it was an interesting time. It was a different space, and things are different, obviously, where we are, but we don't want those individuals to serve as, again, enforcement. We see it more as our liaison to understand if we need to make a call or have contact with an outside agency, because these situations do come up in schools, believe it or not. And sometimes it's good to have someone we can pick up and call on the phone that knows us and we know them. So it hopefully doesn't escalate to a situation where we called the dispatch officer and they put us in contact with someone who didn't have a relationship with us. That sometimes can present a challenge. And so again, I would love to hear your perspective and get a chance, probably offline.
Noah, thank you for participating and being here. And I think the future looks bright if you're just in 11th grade. So I hope you one day think about law school and look me up if you decide that. But I'm glad that you have members of your school board here. That says a lot to me already that they're even here in the room today, because that's huge. But what I would say too is to look at, and I'm happy to help you offline identify schools and school districts that have completely gone away with even their police department presence on campus. So while there are police departments that serve as liaisons, like Zahir said, there are a lot of schools that have completely done away with that and have still come up with a comprehensive safety plan that is grounded with their administrator, with their vice principal. So there are ways to also not, because the school police department is offering resources, there's other ways sort of around that. If that's a value that you've decided, if it's a value that the school district has decided is one that they don't espouse, So I would look for some other examples, right? Because you're going to need to provide that to your administrators. And I'm happy to help you find examples of school districts that have been successful in keeping their schools safe, which is of course the priority of every adult who cares about children, without having the presence of police, a police liaison or a police presence at all on the school campus.
Thank you so much. I will follow up with you about that.
And I will distribute Jyoti's slides so that everybody has her email and contact information. Go ahead,
I have a
John.
question. So in this context, I often hear about the area of attendance as an area that these school resource officers get involved in. And I find that surprising, actually, because I see that as more of a disciplinary issue. Although I believe truancy is somewhere in the penal code. I mean, we had Kamala Harris jailing mothers of truant children, right? So I guess that is technically a legal issue. But where do we see a blurring of the lines between disciplinary issues and criminal issues, to where that line can get overstepped, and something that is merely disruptive and what we would consider bad behavior in the school context, does that end up getting a treatment when you have a school resource officer? Does that end up getting treated as a criminal infraction, whether it be officially or just in how they approach it?
Yes.
Sorry. I was just going to say, in South Pass,
Yes.
our school resource officer has nothing to do with attendance or truancy.
But yes, John, yes.
And in many instances, I use the word escalate, but it increases. So we're looking at progressive disciplinary practices. And so attendance is a call home, chronic attendance is a meeting, then the students are placed on an attendance contract. After that, it is escalated, perhaps to the student attendance review board. And that's when the SRO or police law enforcement is involved, because then it escalates to a citation. And that's when you talked about truancy, because truancy does fall under the penal code. So once a student is escalated to the student attendance review board, they look at a number of issues. They look at mental health, they look at assessing for special education, but they also look at citing a student. And if they still don't see an improvement in attendance, the students are then placed on probation. And so it does kind of evolve from this school related issue to now it is a criminal event.
Would the student be charged if they're a minor, or would it be the parents held responsible?
It's the parents.
Okay.
So the parents are cited for the truancy.
Okay. Thank you.
How about outside of attendance issues? What types of behaviors kind of straddle that line between something that can get you, I don't know, detention hall, and something that can get you actually put into the criminal justice system?
Talking back, willful defiance, which has technically been void now in the California state constitution, but talking out of turn, talking back, reacting, anger. I mean, if you respond in anger and a teacher might feel threatened, they can call a school resource officer over to de-escalate, and that can cause you to have either a suspension or expulsion, which could lead to outside. I mean, these are the concerns when you have school resource officers present, right? Because it's a police framework, right? So while the individual themselves might be a kind person, it's still a policing framework that is now being utilized instead of a helping framework, to use Treesje's word. And I think that framework, again, is what I'm talking about in terms of the values. So it's the presence of the individual, but it's also the framing of the issue.
We have elementary school students who push someone who now have battery on their school record. And so when we look at the terms, even when we're describing disciplinary actions in the school system, we see very similar language used that very much mirrors the penal code and the justice system. And so, to Jyoti's point, of course, drugs or physical, right, altercations would be the first ones you think of, but we also see those moments where students have explosive behaviors. They have issues that they can't control their anger, and then they're placed in a hold. I had a student actually who was sent to psychiatric hospital for a breakdown, but in the process of being transported to the psychiatric hospital, somehow his arm got broken. Dead. And so it's just these moments where a situation that maybe cannot be diffused by school staff then incorporates this other entity that then takes things to another level. And so I think that when we begin to look at the framework of what we're addressing in the school setting, what are we really trying to build? As she said, the future looks bright when we spoke about Noah. Are we trying to create and build model citizens, people that contribute to society? Or are we just trying to make sure that people follow the rules?
Treesje, if you could disassemble all of that structure that currently exists, you are in charge of building and creating and envisioning a new way of, you know, of the relationship there, how would you build it?
Oh man, that's like the three wishes question, the genie and the lamp. I do have actually some projects in the works about even just really looking at how we unlock and cultivate purpose within young minds, and really studying students and children as individuals, to be unpacked and kind of opened up instead of molded and categorized. And I think that our teachers and our educators are tasked with an extraordinary feat, to mold young minds, to not only think according to the knowledge they are given, but to think for themselves. And so if we can provide even our educators more resources that allow them to explore students in terms of their interests, right? So they're more engaged in their learning, we can even see a decrease in some of these behaviors, if you will. I would give every school a psychologist if I could. I really would. And a couple of counselors too, because we do very different things. And students know, they know who they can trust. They know who they can talk to. They know who they can open up. And I believe that our school districts should give them more options. Right? Do they want to talk to Mr. Smith today or Mrs. Johnson? Why should they have to choose? And I think that the way that we fund our school districts is something that we have to look at holistically as a nation, honestly. If we could, right now, I bet every parent would vote to give their teachers a raise during this pandemic. If you polled any parent, because they realize how hard that job is now. I don't know if that answered your question, Julia.
I got a question in the chat to pose, which is, what groups or spaces should we be present in to bring up these concerns and make these changes? What is the entity or authority figure on this issue?
I think it's your school board. I mean, it's your school board, and it's also, and at least in Long Beach, we got help from our mayor's office as well. So they really work in tandem, and we actually also involve our local council members as well, because they are, all elected officials talk to each other, especially, the ones that care about the same issues. And we found that they all cared about our children. And so we went to the school board, we went to city council, we went to every city council meeting, we went to meet with the mayor. This is just to keep our little tiny playground. It's not even a fancy playground. It's not even a South Pasadena playground. Your playgrounds are amazing there. This is just like a little dinky urban playground. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing when friends came to see what we were fighting for, but that's all we have in our community. So we went to City Hall, City Council, school board, and I would also recommend your local council officials as well.
And if I can, I think, funding is also key and central to all of these issues when it comes to additional counseling supports and wellness, resources on campuses. And so the more you can lobby at the state and federal level, I think is also essential because, again, we will continue to supply and allocate funds, I think, based on our priorities, which are dictated in many ways by what our community is pushing, as well as, compared to what we think is sound and positive decision making. But right now, our schools are terribly underfunded in academic sense, let alone on a well-being sense. And so when we look at these ratios, and again, the ideal number of 250 to 1, you may say, well, that, it may sound ideal to strive for that, but I mean, that's still 250 to 1, right? And so what is the access to counseling that's really available? What are the resources that are there? And it goes beyond just general school counseling. Like what are the other resources when it's school psychologist, when it is a social worker, right? All these other positions that need funding and support. Just the resources aren't there. And I think, obviously, please do bring your opinions and ideas to the school board and city council and continue to advocate on a local level. But I think we also have to continue to work on a larger level. And I know as far as our group is concerned, Susie serves as your CSBA representative for our local area, which is nice to have a voice because I know she very much values these issues and has been working on a larger level to lobby for the School Boards Association to put pressure on funding. Because again, the more voices you can get and the collective power you can have, I think the larger that voice can be amplified. So.
Ella, I can comment too. Yeah, just going to the question about the advocating before the city council. So just a few years ago, put it in perspective, I remember sitting at a public safety commission meeting and the school resource officer was presenting. And we were concerned because one big issue was the budget. We just didn't have the budget to put that resource over there. And as he testified, he said every school, kind of what Zahir said, every school wanted him and he couldn't spread out himself enough time because high school wanted him this day, middle school this day, all the elementary schools wanted him. And he was, I forget who it was that year, it was Shannon or the large guy, but it's just, he got along with the teachers, the students. There was a really good relationship. It wasn't more of a police, but as a friend. And we were looking at, well, let's continue the program. School board wants it, teachers, administrators. We didn't realize if there might be a push against it, but really with our budget, we could put him somewhere else for sure. And maybe a kind of a follow-up question. This is taking off my other hat as a soccer coach with youth from 8 to college, high school youth coach for over 30 years, former high school teacher. I still get out there in the schools as I sit on a number of boards and still coach. Last year, just past year, coached boys under 19. How do you bridge that gap so I've always had a good relationship. I was lucky as a kid to have good relationships with cops I'd met as a kid on the street, but I know a lot of kids don't. How do you bridge that gap if we don't have to get the kids so they trust? There's a bridge between cops and kids. And again, I know there's different philosophies of policing. I saw the Daryl Gate years, which were crazy, fought against that. But we're trying to build a nice relationship with our police so if people feel open to come and talk to them, and there's a relationship. So it's not the cops, us against them. That's just kind of a follow-up question too.
I also serve as a judge pro tem in the LA Superior Court. And last year, pre-COVID, I had probably about a dozen cases where minor high school students charged with drug possession. And how does it escalate into in the court system? I mean, I usually ask for a school counselor, continue the case, and then I usually end up putting them in a sort of a probation or program and then expunge the record because I don't want them to have that record in their school record. But how does it get to that far? I mean, it's mind-boggling to me.
I feel like the system is set up as us against them. Like the police is looking at generally at the public as us and them. So I think the responsibility, I hear where you're going with that, Michael, but I feel like that we need to flip that question. we need to be asking the police to be getting rid of the us and them first, because the police have been perpetrators on BIPOC communities, on communities that are unable to, you're not going to defend yourself against a police officer. Like, I feel like at the core, that question needs to be flipped. I think that the responsibility and the onus is on the police department to become anti-racist, to change the way that they're viewing the population that they're serving, because that will change the way that they're interacting with the population. So forgive me, I don't feel like that's the road to go down. I feel like the police need to take that on as their responsibility.
Oh, I agree, 100%. I'm just, we've tried it. There was about 8 years ago, I recall when I asked the chief, I said, why don't we do some outreach to the schools where we get I'll let you run it how you want to, but I'd like to do some outreach because, again, coming from working for an assemblyman in LAPD, I saw the LAPD, just what you said, it was us against them. And I finally found a few young cops in there in Rampart Division where he dressed up in a, outfit and stuff like that. We went to all the schools and stuff like that just to try to get kids out of gangs and a different approach, but it was fought back by the administration. You're right, Julia. I was hoping in South Pass we would bring the same. And when I asked the chief to do that, about a week or two later, I get calls. There's cops show up at the schools with like glasses on and their uniforms. And I said, Chief, what happened? This was a, kind of outreach. And I said, I want you to, after we did that program, I want you to get a sense from the police. The ones that participated, did they like it? What was their, something, there was a large group, this was again, 7, 8, 9 years ago, that didn't want to do it. You're right, Julia. They didn't want it. Some didn't care. And there was a small percentage that said, yeah, we got to do more outreach to the schools. Let's get out there. So you're right. It's changing the culture inside, which is difficult, but I agree.
I just have a question to pose to the group. What is wrong with everyone playing their role, right? Like, can the police officer just be the police officer and the helping professional be the helping professional? I think that when we can allow everyone to, as my mother always said, stay in their lane, and so then we can be most effective at what we do best. Like, keep the main thing the main thing. I think that we want so much for our law enforcement to be helping individuals, right? Caring, helping individuals, and I would love for that to happen. But the reality is they are trained to maintain law and order. They are trained to fight crime. They are given these pods or these hour PDs on mental health and these other things, but the majority of their training is tactical, guns, combat, right? And so then we sprinkle an hour of counseling in there and we want them to help all these people. But then we say, we have all these other individuals who have been to school for years for this. And we don't have as many of them. So I think that I personally think it's okay for the police officers to just be that and do that well.
I'm glad,
and allow the
Treesje.
other individuals to do the other things. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, so sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just was saying, I'm so glad you brought up the training, because the other thing to look into is when you have the school resource officers, even if they're being funded through the police department, it's really critical to look at what training they've had. Like, do they have training that's really de-escalation training? Do they have training on all the issues around mental health, concerns around disability, around the history of the community that they're serving in, right? So even if the school police department is providing this resource officer, who is this person coming and what sort of training do they have? And those are the kind of questions, you could sort of ask to say, short of having the school resource officer no longer in your school, the very least you could say is that we want to make sure that this person is trained in a way that will ensure de-escalation is the first mode, right? And I think that those are things that are perhaps micro steps before you sort of do because again, that's to Treesje's point, I mean, that's sort of what the training is. And the challenge has been nationally to come up. There are no state standards for school resource officer trainings. There are no national standards. There's zero. And so it's a very specific county by county endeavor.
And to Jyoti's point, the same way that you interview any staff member for a position in a school site, I feel that even though this resource is being offered, is it so wrong to make sure that your school resource officer matches the climate of your school or your district? Does your school resource officer have cultural training, right? Are they aware of the populations you serve? Do you have a school resource officer that speaks Spanish? If you serve a majority Hispanic community, do you have a school resource officer that has education in disabilities or in resources to address people that don't have the financial means, right? Socioeconomic status. These are other layers of the students that we are serving, right? We want to teach the whole student. And so I think that we want to make sure that the school resource officers at least have some background and some understanding of the people that they are serving. And so whether that's a school culture, school climate, professional development, and a school resource officer orientation that says, this is what we need from you. This is what we expect as a community. Those are just some small steps that schools can take to begin to even shift and adjust the framework and the way that they're perceived.
Hi, I see that we have 3 school board members here, and we have a council member and a council member elect. And first of all, I appreciate all of your taking time out of your evenings to come and join us for this. I think it really enriches the experience. For our school board members, it sounds like our ratio of counselors to students is actually pretty good. And that's really good to hear. But outside of that, just the I guess the existence of the school resource officer, having police in schools, I guess you could call that kind of a status quo, right? And anytime you have a status quo, I think there are some pressures to maintain that. And for the school board members, what would some of those pressures be to keep things as they are, the current system?
I mean, I think from my perspective, it goes to what you see in a lot of communities, which is when law enforcement encounters individuals, they have some sort of prior relationship with the community or the individuals to which they're engaging with. And that's where, as it was framed to me, and granted, Ruby and I are newer onto the school board, and my understanding of the position, and that's why, Noah, as I mentioned, I'd love to hear from you and your perspective, or other students as well, is that this person is serving as a liaison, as hopefully a bridge to better understand the situation. So if and when, and we are a small city, it is if you're at a high school party and law enforcement comes to break it up, knowing that officer may lead to a situation in which you have some prior history and understanding of this individual and hopefully can, again, de-escalate rather than escalate the situation. There is some cognizant, there's some community that's built there. I think there are good points about who that individual is, or again, the need of it. We do not maintain, again, funding for it. I don't think there is a justification for the school board to dedicate resources towards it. It is something that's funded through SPPD. That individual has other duties outside of just being the school resource officer. And I think you bring up a good point, Noah, too, about the wellness checks, right? And what may happen in those situations. But this is where, again, I hope there's some context or understanding of that individual before they go in for that wellness check, and having it be someone who is designated as the liaison between the district and that wellness check versus whatever officer's on call at that time to do that wellness check hopefully, again, there is an understanding of the situation. There's some context and relationship between administration and that officer to have that communication. And hopefully there's a relationship in which there can be other individuals in that role. I think, you know, there was a great point brought up about, again, can we keep those people in their lanes? I think ideally that would be the situation. I don't know if we have the staffing or personnel for all of these instances, as we do, sadly, in our larger community, right? With engaging with people that are experiencing homelessness or other things along those lines. Do we have the dedicated community staff or services, resources from the county, from the local city resources to service in those needs? And sadly, I think the police are being called at the wrong times to serve the wrong roles, right? And I think that's something we need to look at internally of how are these individuals being utilized? And again, what is their need? What is their role? What is essential? What's definitely non-essential? There are, again, law enforcement situations that come up. I would rather have, when we do have to make that call, it's someone who does have some cognizance and we know who that person is that we're making that call to versus whichever officer may be on call at that moment. That's where I see a benefit. In terms of presence on campus, I'd love to hear from the district side administrators as to what that benefit would be and make sure it also aligns with student and you know, community-based you know, priorities as well, because I think that'd be essential.
I'll take a moment since you asked. So I'm Ruby. I'm one of the other board members, and I see that John just joined. So I'm just a little concerned because we have 3, and so we can't be a majority as far as Brown Act. So we're kind of turning this into a mini school board meeting by having 3 board members on here. So I would say that we need to continue the conversation at a school board meeting because I don't want to go and have a meeting now with 3. I hope you understand that piece, but I will way over and say mental health 100%. And we, as a community, have put a big priority on mental health. And one of our main goals of Measure S, which is our local parcel tax, was not only class size reduction, which meant more access to teachers, but also for counseling support. And that is one of the reasons why we've been so fortunate, though we are in the bottom 10th of all funding statewide for schools, to be able to provide counselors. And Natasha Prime, our school social worker, is part of Measure S funding. She is split between the middle and the high school, and it would be lovely to have more access to her for our middle and high school students. We also talked about community mental health clinics, and the Department of Mental Health does have dollars and they do partner with certain schools, but unfortunately those are students who have schools that have a very high percentage of free and reduced lunch students, Medi-Cal population, which we do not have here in South Pasadena. I've looked for community partnerships in a variety of ways, but as a pediatrician, the American Academy of Pediatrics clearly states, as you all said earlier, kids spend their times in schools. So it would be great if we could get all their services where they are. And that's mental health. But it goes right back to what Zahir said, and that's funding of schools. And unfortunately, we have not been in a good place. I do know that when you start comparing Trump versus Biden, as far as what could potentially happen with schools, we hopefully have something really positive to look forward to as far as school funding and getting to the place where we'll finally start funding special ed, which is a big piece of school district budgets. You know, the federal government and the state was really supposed to be funding a lot of that. And unfortunately, districts are funding the priority of that. And that eats into budgets. We're kind of getting in a tangent, but I'm going to actually hop off because we've got 3 board members on here. So I just want to take a moment to thank you all and continue the conversations. So thank you. I'm going to hop off. Good night.
Thanks, Ruby.
Thank you, Ruby.
I want to be respectful of our fabulous presenter time. I think we've gone like an hour and 20. So, you know, I think that they're both happy to, you know, take some questions offline via email if folks have follow-up that they, you know, they're burning questions they still want to discuss. And of course, the members of Care First, me, Helen, John, Matthew, Bill, a bunch of folks who are on this call are all ready to work with people who want to work on this issue. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. But thank you. Thank you, Jyoti and Treesje. This was fabulous. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our electeds who joined as well. We really appreciate your time.
Be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Well,
so
bye-bye.
much, everyone, for listening and joining in today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.